I call this meeting to order. So welcome meeting number 121 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Language. I would like to remind everyone at the table here in person about the notice that we received, the little cards on the table, in order to avoid feedback incidents that could cause harm to our interpreters. So please take care to read the card and respect the guidelines. So we return to the continuum, minority language education continuum, the study that we're conducting, pursuant to Standing Order 108.3F and the motion adopted by the committee on April 29, 2024. The committee will resume its study of the minority language education continuum. I wish to welcome this morning our witnesses that will be with us for the first hour. Remotely, we have Mr. Yvon Laberge, President and Chief Executive Officer of Educacentre College, and from Northwest Francophone Education Region. I'm not sure which Northwest it is, because in New Brunswick we have a Northwest School Board in Madawaska Rescue in my area. So for the Northwest Ontario, I imagine Sylviane Maisonneuve. No, it's not Ontario. Alberta, my apologies. It's true, Ms. Maisonneuve. We've seen you here before. There's no translation? Just a moment.
On va attendre un petit instant tout le monde.
We'll just wait for a moment, everyone. This is the interpreter testing. Hope that the sound is coming through. Testing 1, 2, 3. The interpreter is on the English channel. No, apparently it's a problem. There's no problem, actually. If I speak in French, do you hear me in English? It's corrected. It's fixed. Good. So, for the Northwest Francophone Education Region, Sylviane Maisonneuve, Board Chair, and Brigitte Kopielnitsky. Is that right? Did I pronounce it right? Superintendent. So welcome for the people here remotely. For some of you, it's the first time. So the way we operate is that we let each organization make a 5-minute presentation. Talk to us about who you are, what your expectations are, and then after that we have rounds of questions from the different political parties. It's interactive with questions and answers, so I'll guide you through that. But I'm very strict about time, so the more strict you are on the time, the more time we have for questions. So I'll give you each organization 5 minutes to give your introductory observations. Exactly 5 minutes. We'll start with Mr. Laberge for the Educacentre College. Please go ahead, Mr. Laberge. We're listening. Thank you, Chair and honorable members of the committee. Good morning. I am pleased to join you today to discuss the issues of post-secondary education in French in Francophone minority communities. I'm going to be speaking mainly about the objective of funding from federal sources for post-secondary institutions serving official language minority communities in Canada. My observations will focus on the Francophone minority context in British Columbia and the college Educacentre. So Educacentre College has been established since 1992 in British Columbia and is distinguished as the only French language college in the province. It is a non-profit and benevolent organization with a provincial mandate. Since 2015, Collège Educacentre has been recognized as a private college by the training institutions branch of British Columbia, and the provincial government has refused giving us a public college status. This status deprives the College Educacentre of certain funding opportunities, such as at the federal level, for example, the Post-Secondary Infrastructure Fund. In 2023-2024, Collège Educacentre served close to 2,900 people in all programs and services combined, including 1,018 registrations or enrollments at the college level. And the college trains the vast majority of French-speaking educators in the province. In September 2025, the college plans to welcome up to 25 French-speaking international students who we hope will choose to remain in the province after their studies. The funding of Collège Educacentre remains the crucial issue to be resolved for the fiscal year upcoming. The 80% of the funding is federal, and the rest comes from revenue-generating activities. Of the overall budget, 21% comes from the official languages education program, and out of that amount, 52% is basic funding, and the remainder is on a project-by-project basis. But the basic funding amount granted to the college has remained unchanged since 2014. The gap between the increase in the cost of living and the funding on a static basis result in a number of consequences. I'll mention two of them. The increasing gap in operating costs between that and the basic funding presents significant risk for the future of the Éducation to college. The fact that it's impossible to provide increases complicates recruitment of employees, and this raises two major concerns. One concern has to do with the financial disengagement of the province, and the other one has to do with the absence of a federal funding envelope for post-secondary. And these two factors contribute to the stagnation of the basic funding. In our opinion, that is the responsibility of the federal department to ensure that the province respects its commitment to pay 50% as a counterpart of the funding. If the province doesn't fulfill its obligation, then it would be up to the federal department to take measures to ensure that the necessary funding is available for the college, including discussions with the province or even legal measures if necessary. So we are putting forward for your consideration 3 recommendations. The first one is that the Canadian government provide a permanent funding envelope for supporting post-secondary education for OLMCs to provide stable funding to these institutions. This permanent funding would make it possible for the institutions to plan in the long term, to improve working conditions, and to provide high-quality programs. The second recommendation is for the Government of Canada to show flexibility in the interpretation of these provisions for areas where the government refuses to recognize them as public institutions. And finally, that the Canadian government take concrete steps to support post-secondary institutions for OLMCs where provinces or territories fail to meet their obligations in financial commitments. If a province or territory refuses to contribute equitably to the funding of these institutions, the federal government should consider filling the funding gap directly. By including these recommendations in your efforts to solve the challenge of stability and funding, you could contribute to strengthening the viability of the Collège Éducation on a financial basis and guarantee its role on an ongoing basis in post-secondary French language education in British Columbia. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Laberge. And now for the Northwest Francophone Education Region, is it Ms. Maisonneuve or Ms. Kropielnicki? Ms. Maisonneuve? Yes, Chair and members of the committee, thank you. My name is Sylviane Maisonneuve, and I'm president of the Conseil Scolaire du Nord-Ouest, the CSNO, in Alberta. Thank you for offering me this opportunity to appear before you today. I'm going to talk about the issues that are crucial to ensuring survival of the Francophone language and culture in the Northwest region. The CSNO territory covers Northwest Alberta from Slave Lake to British Columbia border and all the way to the Northwest Territories border. We now have 3 Francophone schools from kindergarten through grade 12, accommodating some 460 students. First of all, I'd like to deal with the issue of early childhood centers, or ECCs. They are essential to help parents pass on language and culture and to prepare children for their school careers. The CSNO has long recognized the importance of offering these services within its schools. We operate 3 ECCs a daycare, preschool, and before and after school programs in Grande Prairie, a daycare preschool in Peace River, and a preschool in Falher. Following numerous requests from parents, we are in the process of opening a French language daycare in the school. Parents in our communities are grateful for the $10 a day Canada-Alberta agreement for daycare between Alberta and Canada, which has had a very positive effect in our region, but there are two major challenges for early childhood. The lack of certified Francophone early childhood educators in northwestern Alberta. In Alberta, certification of educators is the responsibility of the Ministry of Children's Services. Although this department encourages young people to pursue a career in early childhood education, there is very little promotion of French to attract Francophone population to this career. The second challenge is adding space for an early childhood center in new school production projects. The delay between announcement of a new construction and approval by the federal for complementary funding in infrastructure is too long, resulting in wasted time for the architectural team and a lack of opportunities. There ought to be a more fluid process to ensure collaboration between the two levels of government to avoid delays or the risk of not having space dedicated early enough for childhood services in Francophone minority schools. The CSNO benefits from the official languages minority program in the OLEP. Alberta's 4 French language schools are collaborating with the Education Department, and CSNO is very grateful for this. This financial support enables CSNO to offer its students and teachers projects that promote language and culture in our schools. However, we believe that funds allocated to Alberta are insufficient to respond to the remarkable increase in the number of rights holders in our province. OLEP is important for us because the programming and retention of students in secondary in our schools remains a challenge, especially in the Grande Prairie community where we have to compete with single-track immersion schools and specialized programs. And in addition, the shortage of French-speaking teachers has existed for several years, but recently has worsened. Teaching positions remain unfilled for several months or even an entire school year, preventing our students from accessing a French language education equivalent to that of the English schools. The solutions could include a national campaign to encourage young people to pursue studies in education as scholarships for graduates working in rural minority communities. The Court Challenges program is inadequately funded to enable school boards to effectively claim the right to their Section 23 rights. However, they should be able to effectively demand their rights on behalf of rights holders. The latest data obtained from the enumeration of entitled persons has been crucial for the CSNO in its efforts to create new schools and modernize existing ones. It is essential to maintain this practice as the absence of data prevents provinces from fully grasping the needs and issues at stake. These data have enabled us to demonstrate that many rights holders on our territory do not have access to French education. For example, in Grande Prairie, École Nouvelle Frontière, which serves 180 students from kindergarten to 12, is located in the southwest of the city. Enumeration data show that some 500 children of entitled parents live in the northern region of Grande Prairie, but fewer than 50 children from this region attend the Nouvelle Frontière school. Finally, funding for our only minority post-secondary institution remains a major challenge for our province. Campus Saint-Jean and the Centre Collégial de l'Alberta cannot, for lack of adequate support, offer the programs to which our students should have access. In Alberta, senior high school students have the opportunity to earn dual credits, i.e., credits for a college course and a high school course. Unfortunately, our students interested in various trades must take these courses in English as they are not provided in French. Accordingly, our students who wish to earn these credits are not receiving a secondary education in French. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm available to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Madame Maisonneuve. The first round of questions, it will be interactive, around 6 minutes each for each political formation. We'll start with the Conservatives with Mr. Godin, the first vice chair of this committee. We have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for our witnesses to allow us to be better. My first question is for Mr. Laberge.
Ouais. Éducation.
And from Educa Center, you have talked, Mr. Laberge, that you have 1,018 inscriptions for 23-24. Is that right? Yes, 1,018 enrollments. I only have 6 minutes. If you could respond like quickly so we can go faster. You mentioned 25 immigrants in 2025 who are on the our plan for 2025. Yes. Mr. Laberge, what is the occupation rate of your school right now? 110%. So there are too many students. Exactly. How many students have showed interest to go to your school and who were rejected? At the college level, we don't have waiting lists, but in other language programs like Link and Click, there are long wait lists. Thank you, Mr. Laberge. Mr. Laberge, you also indicated that the provincial government did not recognize you as a public institution. Right. What is the impact of this on your administration? As I mentioned in my statement, first of all, it takes away access from basic funding. Colleges such as ours should have a budget around 15 million. And right now we are at 790,000. So you're doing a lot with very little. Yes. And we have, there are various funding programs from the federal government that allow us to compensate. How does the provincial government justify its refusal to recognize you as a public institution? That's a good question. I don't have a clear answer to your question. I think it's a matter of positioning of francophones in terms of the population numbers relative to others. So they don't have a recognition of the French language as an official language. Mr. Laberge, last question for you.
Des ayants droit.
Does it respect the rule of right holders? Yes, but the rule of right holders does not apply to secondary school. Article 23 does not apply. I hope that our report will have this result. Now I would like to turn to our people from our witnesses from Alberta, Madame Laberge, Madame Kopinski. Madame Maisonneuve, sorry. You identified the lack of educators, a major problem. Could you tell us how you recruit right now with the people who are working professionally with you? We have two problems. We mentioned early childhood centers and also certified educators. For early childhood, we find our candidates, especially through people who are already working in schools. They have the encouragement of their families to pursue their vocation. But there are hurdles since the college center does not offer a remote training. So those educators get English training. That's for early childhood. I will let Brigitte continue for the certified educators. Yes, we post our vacancies all over the place. I'll give you an example. About 10 years ago, for each position, we would get a whole bunch of resumes. Last year, for all the vacancies that we posted, we received perhaps 3 resumes. That's a real problem, Madame Kopinski. I have a last question. You talked about right holders, and I have to say that the committee here in 2019 in the census to have this, and it's a victory of the official languages committee, regardless of the political affiliation. Now, what is your clientele, your primary clientele compared to those who could be and but are being rejected? Do you have this information, Madame Maisonneuve? I'll let Brigitte. If you don't have it, perhaps you can send it to us through the clerk of the committee. If I understood your question correctly, the right holders who, no, the number of right holders as opposed to the number of people right now who are getting French language education in your sector. We'll have to get back to this because we're past the 6 minutes. The next one we have Mr. Angelo Iacono. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses to be with us this morning. My first question is for Madame Maisonneuve and Mr. Laberge. In your opinion, we look at the recent changes brought to the Official Languages Act in terms of funds that are transferred to the provinces and territories for minority language education, for them to be directed to minority school boards. Do you think it gets the job done? If I understand correctly, you're talking about the OLEP funds. Yes, as I mentioned in my statement, Alberta, over the last few years, saw a huge increase as compared to right holders. Number of right holders increased, but the funding amount did not follow. So we see that the allocated amount is insufficient. After Ontario, Alberta is the province with the highest number of right holders for French language education outside Quebec. Mr. Laberge. Well, I cannot speak on behalf of school boards, but for post-secondary education in BC, at the college level, we're the only ones. And at the university level, it is the Bureau of French Francophone Affairs of Simon Fraser University, which has the best structure, as we can call a French language. Now, there are other major universities that get a lot of money, huge amounts for OLEP, which takes away money from us. I know very well Gino Leblanc, the general manager of the BAP, and he says the same thing. He would need more resources. These resources are re-affected to major English language institutions. Thank you, Mr. Laberge. Mr. Laberge, a major concern we hear quite often is shortage of labor in education. What does your institution do to deal with this shortage? Secondly, do you offer incentives to encourage enrollment in your programs? Answer, we have two programs that deals directly with education. One is for early childhood, and the other one is specialized help for educators. The majority of work in the college sector is early childhood. Now, as I mentioned, we are the only institution that can offer French language training. So we're training most of the educators in French in the province.
La deuxième partie.
Regarding the second part of your question, could you please remind me what it was? It's quite early here. Do you offer incentives to encourage through funding that we get from Heritage Canada, we get a certain number of scholarships for young people, people that are out of immersion. But at the college level, we do not really get students that come from immersion programs, because once they've done their second year in immersion, usually they go to university. So that's why I'm saying that a bit of flexibility in funding envelopes would be useful, and we could take the scholarships for those immersion students and to use them for students' first language. Madame Maisonneuve, the community hears about the proximity to school is a huge problem faced by many families. Could you tell us about the territory of your school board, and also are the students, are your schools close to where members of the community live? That is a good question. In fact, we have a huge territory in northern Alberta. It's made up mostly of rural regions. We have 3 schools on this territory, and they cover 3 villages/cities. But outside of these centers, there are still right holders. There are right holders based on the data that we were able to analyze. There are right holders at the very north of the province that do not have access to French language education, and also west and southwest of our territory around Slave Lake. There is quite an important population, but it's spread out all over our region. We've had requests, which we'll be exploring soon, but again, restrictions in terms of funding make things difficult. Thank you, Madame Maisonneuve. Thank you, Madame Escono. 6 minutes is fast. Now, the next questions will be from the Bloc Québécois, the second vice chair of this committee. Mr. Beaulieu, the floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our guests. First of all, regarding the Northwest School Board, I would like to go back to what my colleague was saying. What is the number of right holders versus the number of vacancies or spots in your schools? It's a good question.
480 élèves inscrits.
So according to the statistics from 2021, we have a potential of close to 2,000. So we had a witness who talked to us last week about the fact that in this region, I think it's in Ontario, and there were a lot of schools where there were a lot of people who were not rights holders, but who were accepted to those schools because there was a shortage of students. So in order to keep their budget envelope, they had to accept Anglophones or people who do not speak French. Is that the case in your schools? No, I wouldn't say so. We accepted certain exceptions, but we have an administrative directive about the percentage that we accept. So it's exceptional. The majority, the vast majority of our students are rights holders. And I'll give the floor to Ms. Kropielnicki to add to that. Among those exceptions, we find Francophone immigrants who do not yet have Canadian citizenship, but who are from French-speaking countries, and we consider them as exceptions in our schools. And are you entitled to, in the school board, do you have the right to define new rights holders? Because what we understood yesterday is, or the day before yesterday, the school boards can accept people who are not rights holders, and then they become rights holders. Fortunately, the province gives us full management of that issue, so sure, we can manage the students who are accepted or not. Fine, it's just a detail, but earlier you said that you were the province with the greatest number of rights holders apart from Ontario. Do you have more rights holders than New Brunswick? That's not very important, but I found it surprising. Well, according to the data that I have, the answer would be yes, but Ms. Kropelnitsky could answer. In Western Ontario, we have, according to the stats, 68,000 rights holders in the province. Okay, thank you very much. As regards the Educacentre College, as I understand it, you are the only college, Francophone college in BC. So there are no colleges, no public Francophone colleges in British Columbia? That's correct. And there is no university either for and run by Francophones in BC. No, as I said, the closest is the Francophone and Francophile Affairs Bureau, which is connected with Simon Fraser University. The other universities, you might have a few people who are in the education faculty or in the languages faculty. Anyway, one of your main problems is that you're not recognized as a public college, so it's the lack of political will of the BC government that results in the fact that you're unable to build up to the scale you wish. Precisely. And actually, the students that come to your institutions, are they mainly students coming from French language schools in British Columbia, or do you accept also a lot of Anglophones or people who are not rights holders? In the college programs, they come from the school, Francophone school boards, or they are people who are recent immigrants who may have done a year or not at the school board, but who come to provide, to get education from us. And most of our college students are, for the most part, on average, I would say, are between 32 and 34 years old. So they're quite an advanced adult population. In other words, they want to go back to school, right? So as I understand it as well, not very many Anglophones go to your institution. Not in the programs at the college level, but we also offer language training on French as a second language to immigrants. And there is a mix of plenty of immigrants from various countries, and also our LINK program puts priority on Francophones, but the IRCC encourages us to accept other students apart from Francophones because there are substantial waiting lists in those programs. So only 5 seconds, Mr. Beaulieu. Do you answer or respond to the demand from French? Do you fulfill the demand from French schools, or are you short of space? No, we do not fulfill the demand. Thank you, Ms. Leberge. We can get back to that. Apologies. The fourth 6-minute round from the NDP for questions. Ms. Dance.
MP in the House of Commons in terms of
yeah.
in term, I mean, she's recently here, so congratulations.
Merci.
Elle a gagné durant une partielle, donc c'est la plus jeune en termes de longévité, si on veut, députée à la Chambre des communes tout de suite. Donc, welcome to this committee, Mrs. Dance, and the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais demander...
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask my questions in English.
I'll start by asking Mademoiselle Maisonneuve, you spoke about the serious labor shortage, including teachers and support staff across the board, and we heard about the lack of post-secondary training available. So I wondered if you thought that if the federal government invested more in post-secondary education around French languages, that it would help solve some of the issues that you're seeing in your area.
I think that's a very valid question and a very valid solution. As we mentioned in the presentation, we have the Alberta has a double credit system, so having better programs at the secondary level would certainly help in that way that our students could explore a larger variety of careers, and we all know that in their language, and we all know that when people are formed locally or close to locally, there is more chances of them staying. So that would definitely help.
And you did mention a little bit about online and virtual classes. So I'll ask you, do you think that would allow people from your community to train? And then I'll go back to Monsieur Laberge and ask him if he's offering any online classes that might be available.
Yeah, I think that online classes would be a great addition. I mean, our region is quite removed, quite rural. We're 5 hours north of Edmonton, which is where our Francophone post-secondary education institutions are. And also some people pursue this post-secondary education in later years during adult training, as we said, for our éducatrices. And they're working full-time. So being able to access these courses online is a great advantage.
Monsieur Laberge?
Mr. Laberge?
College-level programs are offered online because the Francophone population in British Columbia is really spread out across the province. And so there's no... there are no enclaves, Francophone communities like you may have in Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba. People are really spread out everywhere. So yes, that's our bread and butter when it comes to college-level programming. It's distance education.
Oh, okay. And that's it. So, in my writing of Elma Transcona, we have quite a few French immersion schools, and I actually graduated from one of them. However, I know that there is right now they're overflowing with students, and so some are being turned away and not having that opportunity. And we only have one French university in Winnipeg, L'Université de Saint-Boniface, and again, it's another one that has to turn away students because of the access. So I wonder about whether we could use province to province, whether you could take online classes at the University of St. Boniface and move it over to different rural and remote areas, such like what Madame Maisonneuve is talking about. Do you know of any of your staff that's accessing stuff or people that are accessing it in that way?
And you're posing the question to me or to Madame
sorry,
Maisonneuve?
to Madame Maisonneuve, please.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Do you think that, do you have anybody that's accessing the online services through like the Université de Saint-Boniface, which is in Winnipeg, or in other provinces?
Not that I know of. I will allow Madame Kropelnicki to answer this question. I do believe there are provincial restrictions on that, on the certification. Okay. But go ahead.
No, all our early learning educators are doing it online with Anglophones because of the practicum certification.
So do you think it'd be beneficial to do something that would open it up across Canada? If it's province to province?
It would be great.
Oh, okay, that's an interesting, it's just, I'm learning as I go, so thank you so much for that. I know we also talked a little bit about the daycare spaces, and I'm really proud of what the NDP's done, and my colleague Alia Gazan introducing an amendment to ensure that Franco-Manitobans or Francophones in majority situations have access to childcare services in French. So I just wanted to know if that's something that you think has been helpful in putting some of those in some of the different schools.
I think that has been absolutely helpful, and as we know, early intervention is the key to language and acquisition and enhancement of transmission of culture. It has made a real difference, as I presented in presentation earlier, these services did not exist before the $10 day daycare option. So we've developed all these programs in the last couple of years, and they're well attended. They're full capacity, and highly appreciated by our parents.
Perfect. Thank you both so much.
Merci, Madame Dance. Merci, Madame Maisonneuve.
Thank you, Ms. Dance and Ms. Maisonneuve. The next questions will be 5 minutes each for the next two parties, starting with the Conservatives. Mr. Dalton, you have 5 minutes. Thank you to the witnesses. And Ms. Maisonneuve, I have many family members in your area from Grande Prairie towards Slave Lake and even Maisonneuve's. So perhaps we're connected. So schools, the Francophone School Board, but when I read that, are they Catholic schools? Are they Catholic schools? We are a composite school board with 3 schools. One is Catholic and the other 2 are public. So the Catholic school, is it, where are the 2 schools? The Catholic school is at Falaire, and the 2 public ones are in Peace River and Grande Prairie. Okay, so I have a lot of recollection of the region. My father was in the military, so I didn't live there, but often visited in the 60s and 70s, and the family was very big, and everyone spoke French. But with smaller families and bigger farms, there's a reduction. Is the trend or the direction for the number of students, is it going downward on account of demographics, or is it remaining steady? How is it going? I think that back from the time when what you mentioned, there's certainly been a reduction. But in recent years, I believe that the population is fairly stable, neither increasing nor decreasing. But that's the thing. There are certainly fewer people in the remote regions than there used to be at a certain time. Are there more and more immigrants or children from immigrant families? Once again, it's not really like in the cities, but we're starting to see more and more of them, and especially in larger cities like Grande Prairie, we have a fairly large immigrant population.
And does the large majority of the money come from the province? Is the federal funding a lot? Does it bring a lot? Absolutely. The federal grants from the OLEP allows us to offer programs that we could not otherwise offer. We have cultural animation, for example, in our schools. We have a course on leadership, which leads to credits. We fund half of the kindergarten because the province only funds half of the province. We do a promotion marketing, so that's good. I want to ask other questions as well. Thank you. Last question. Do you have relations with secondary schools that offer immersion programs, perhaps for other programs, other courses, other like sports? Not a lot. I'll let my colleague answer this question. No, we don't have shared services between immersion schools. Mr. Laberge, you mentioned that 87% of the funding comes from the federal. Do students pay a tuition as well? Yes. What is the percentage of the cost? I'm not sure I understood your question. For example, when a student goes to university, Simon Fraser or other, the tuition is usually 1/3 of the total cost. For your institution, how much is it? It's about the same. Okay.
Fermé.
Has the door always been closed as far as being recognized by the provincial government? It's private, but you want to be public. Is this your desire or not?
Desir.
Yes, it is our desire. I've been there since 2010, and I asked each time to the provincial government, and I'm being told no. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Mr. Marc Serré for the Liberals, we have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to our witnesses today to help us enrich our study. We did more extensive study in May on post-secondary education. Mr. Laberge, I understand your challenges. I'm not sure if we look at the 80 million of permanent funding from the federal government, how much this will be helpful if the province is not there at all. So we have huge challenges on a regional basis. But I would like to focus on early childhood as because it's very important. First question to Mr. Laberge and Madame Maisonneuve. You have training right now for early childhood educators. What is your current capacity? I think perhaps you have room to, you don't have any room to maneuver, but what is the capacity? What is the demand? Do all students who graduate get a job right away? And how much money would you need? Do you know, like for construction, to have more educators for early childhood in your province? Regarding early childhood, just to repeat that our college programs are remote programs, so space is not an issue. Now, in terms of additional capacity, we could easily double our enrollments, and it wouldn't be too much. We could add a few educators to train students, but we could easily double the number. Now, regarding operating funds, I think we could easily absorb next year another $1 million for basic funding. This would allow us to really solidify our operations. Regarding infrastructure, we have various projects that are ongoing, namely a very technical program that we'd like to offer in Victoria, and we would be requiring about 2.5 million for this. Thank you, Mr. Laberge. Madame Maisonneuve, thank you very much for the work you do and with early childhood. I understand the challenges that you have for funding per student, which penalize you on the provincial level. But I would like to hear about the training in terms of early childhood. What is your capacity? Do you have? What are the challenges? And what can the federal government can do to help you to get more educators and also to make sure that we have more French-speaking students in early childhood? Okay, let me answer. First of all, I want to say that we have a challenge in terms of spaces. We can access funds for infrastructure from the federal government, and this is great for new construction. But there are challenges in terms of timing and communication between the two levels of government. Also, for old constructions where we cannot add extra space, we can't do anything because the funds cannot be used for older spaces. Regarding your second question, Brigitte, I'll let you answer. Well, the main challenge we have in terms of recruiting is the costs. Most of our educators are moms. They want to take the class, but they don't necessarily have the means. So right now, the school board funds some of our educators with the funds from OLEP, but it's not sufficient. Madame Maisonneuve, could you write to the committee and give us more details, more specific examples regarding your challenges in terms of fluidity of funding between like the provincial level and the federal level? If you could write this to the committee, we much appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Serré. Next question, 2.5 minutes, Mr. Beaulieu. Yes. Earlier, regarding Educacentre, you said that you don't have enough to supply to satisfy the demand you have for secondary education in BC. Could you tell us more about this? Okay, one of the challenges that we have is to attract people to our institution because we only have 6 college programs. We feel a limited need. If we had additional programs, and I mentioned earlier a infrastructure project that we'd like to implement in Victoria, it would be to offer a program in sound techniques in cooperation with a college in Alma, which requires a studio, the construction of a studio, and for the studio to be equipped for the students. This will allow us to attract a new kind of clientele. Most of our clients are women. We would like to attract more men, and there is a demand that has been expressed from the school board to that effect. The other component, we also have developed a partnership with a French language school board to offer dual programs like in Alberta. This is starting to take shape. We also started a program for adults. It's called Le Cornouillet. It's the equivalent of a grade 12 for adults. So it's for students who need to complete their secondary education before enrolling in our programs. Okay, when we look at the situation as a whole, there are no public colleges. The provincial government is not being flexible. I think it's scandalous. Don't you think we could have some kind of a campaign to denounce this? I don't think it makes any sense. 10 seconds, Mr. Laberge. I think I will keep it for later. Thank you very much. 2.5 minutes is quick. And I'm dense. You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much.
That they're seeing specifically in Northern Alberta, which I'm sure is what is exactly happening across the country in many remote or rural communities, even though I'm sure it's being seen in some of the city centers as well. Is there any is there a specific level that's missing? So is that the daycare level that we're missing teachers? Are we missing, early years, middle years? Is there something specific? And do you have any recommendations as to what the government could do very specifically to maybe do that, whether that involves helping with tuition, access to courses, those types of specific items?
I think it's across the board. I will allow Madame Kropelnicki to answer this question.
Yes, it's across the board. In the past, it was mainly high school, but now we are seeing the shortage trickling into elementary. I believe that teachers, if they had a bursary for working in remote areas like doctors do, that would probably encourage them to coming up north. Right now, the biggest challenge we have, I just want to add, is a lot of students that we're getting are from immigration, and they don't want to leave the big cities. So a lot of teachers are not working in the big cities. They're subbing, but they refuse to come up north. But if they had a little incentive, money-wise to come up north, they might come.
That's very interesting. I hadn't even thought about stuff like that. And so I know I've only got like 45 seconds. Was there anything that you don't feel like you had a chance to speak to in all the questions that you got that you might want to just touch on right now quickly?
Yeah, I just want to touch on quickly on this whole labor thing too. Another problem we have is if we do succeed in attracting labor to our area, there's a housing issue as well. So that becomes a bit of a challenge. Some school boards in our area own their own houses, and they can accommodate their employees, but we don't have the financial capacity to do that.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame Dance.
Thank you, Madame Dance. I will take advantage of my privilege. We have, as a chair, we have less than 2 minutes. Mr. Laberge, you said, in our opinion, the government should have permanent funding envelopes for post-secondary. You also mentioned when provinces do not assume their responsibility that the government should act. You said, in our opinion. Did you receive some advice to that effect? Well, it's our analysis of the situation. There was a precedent that was established, which the Université de l'Ontario Français, where 100% of the amount was granted with the expectation that the provincial government would be investing in the 5 years funding cycle. I think it would be possible to do something like this. Mr. Laberge, could you share this analysis with the committee? I think it would it kind of answers a lot of questions. Could you share this? Is this something that is public? I don't want to force you, but is it something that could be read by the committee and that would be part of a report? I would have to write it. I have little pieces here and there, but these are arguments that we use to try to get more money from Heritage. Well, if you can, please feel free to share this with the clerk, and it will be shared with everyone. And last question, 30 seconds. This position, we've heard it from other witnesses. Does this not encourage a disengagement of provinces and territories to do the work that they must do? It seems so easy to say if they don't do it, it's up to the federal government. Isn't that a kind of signal it would send to the provinces and territories that are not very disciplined? You are 100% right when you say this. This is why the federal government would use legal recourses, because provinces sign agreements with the OLEP, and if they do not comply with their agreements, there can be legal measures that we could be using. Very good point. So I'll leave you to that. Mr. Laberge, Madame Koperniky, Madame Maisonneuve, thank you very much. If there is additional information that you did not have time to share with us, please do not hesitate to send it to us in writing via the clerk, as I mentioned earlier, which we'll share. So we will suspend to make room for the next panel. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, again.
subject to 103F and the motion of the committee in April 2024, continuing our study on the Maori language education continuum. Welcome to our witnesses who will be here for the second hour. Stephanie Chouinard, full professor on a personal basis, and Mr. Bourgeois, also in person here. I think it's your first time. Welcome. Also appearing on a personal basis. So 5 minutes each. I'm very strict on the time. That leaves more time for questions. So it's a difficult timekeeping task. So we'll start with Mr. Bourgeois for the first 5 minutes. Please go ahead. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation.
If so, why is it successful, and how successful is it? Can we prove it? What if we could prove that the presence of a school could guarantee that an official language minority community could survive 80 years, and that the absence of a school would lead to its disappearance in 40 years? Would we fund early childhood development and employability differently if we knew that the former contributed 10 times more than the latter to OLMC vitality? If we could prove that education is the most important tool to ensure vitality, should we not fund it adequately before spending elsewhere? If so, would parliamentarians accept to modify public spending accordingly? Would governments stand firm against vested interest groups? I don't know. But it behooves parliamentarians to assess the results of public policies, programs, and investments in official languages. This is required to enhance effectiveness and efficiency, as well as democratic accountability. To perform such an assessment, we must first set precise ends to achieve. Is it equality, equivalence, progression, vitality? They've all been used, and they all pose challenges. I propose sustainability. It is more aspirational and measurable, and it is better aligned with the theory of being, which best reflects OLMC reality. But regardless of which end is chosen, we must identify all potential interventions and especially determine the relative importance of each one. Education and early childhood development are the sectors most worthy of public support. They should thus be funded accordingly. This core business presently receives most of the funds on official languages, but perhaps they should be funded even more, and if required, at the expense of other sectors. After identifying specific ends and the best means to such ends, we must adopt a coherent national tripartite strategic plan in minority education. A plan to ensure that minority school boards achieve their double mandate. A plan that is strategic, that means evidence-based priorities come first. A plan that is coherent, investments are set to maximize results. A plan that integrates and synergizes federal, provincial, territorial, and community actions. A plan that frames actions longer than 5 years. And a plan that assesses and updates the means. Many such plans already exist, so no need to start from scratch, but they must be revised in light of the long-term ends and through the lens of the minority. Since your mandate is to study the first language education continuum in OLMCs and report your findings and your recommendations to the House, I tried to put myself in your shoes, so I wrote my thoughts as findings and recommendations for your consideration. In addition to the adoption and full implementation of a coherent national minority language education plan, I submit 5 additional recommendations. Education must be recognized and prioritized as the most important public service in support of the intergenerational transmission of language and culture. Minority families must be supported in their efforts to transmit the language and culture to their children, notably during early childhood and the school years. Minority early childhood centers and daycares must be supported in a manner proportional to their importance, similar to our support for minority schools. minority school boards must be supported and assessed in their efforts to enhance students' identity construction and their community sustainability. And 5, minority school boards must be granted the exclusive educational powers indicated by Section 23 and be supported to ensure they are fully implemented. In short, if we don't ensure the success of the minority language education and early childhood systems, the core business, all other actions will be for naught. Thank you for your attention. I will try my best to answer your questions.
Merci, Monsieur Bourgeois. Madame Chouinard.
Thank you, Mr. Bourgeois. Ms. Chouinard, you have 5 minutes. Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. Thank you for welcoming me here once again to talk about the minority language education continuum. One sentence summarizes what I want to say. Until such time as the continuum is completed and there's equal quality managed for and by our communities, the vitality of the communities will remain precarious. The education continuum is now mentioned explicitly in the Official Languages Act, but even before that progress was made, it was already clear that until such time as all the parts of the puzzle from early childhood through to post-secondary education are in place, troubling failings will exist in primary and secondary school protected by the Charter. Let me start at the beginning, early childhood. The first direct attack on the vitality of our communities in the field of education is to observe that for each spot available in French language daycare outside Quebec, there are 4 other children who remain deprived of a spot and who go to an English language daycare. Those 4 children, unless Herculean measures are taken by their family, many of whom are from outside the country, will not be able to move forward in kindergarten as those from the daycare in French. So they already have a twofold mandate to fulfill the objectives of the provincial curriculum and to act as a cultural provider for the minority. The additional burden of teaching French to young francophones, it's a huge burden, unjustly so, and especially since we have a huge shortage of qualified personnel, which brings me to the other end of the continuum. Even if we are able to get it included in the new act for the learning and for daycare for young children, for dedicated funding for minority language communities, it doesn't go far enough. The language clauses are absolutely necessary to ensure that the provinces invest the fair share of funding from the federal government in the service of our communities. Consultations with communities must also form part of the negotiation of these agreements in order to ensure that their priorities are taken into account. The history of the funding of official languages education programs has shown for a long time that we cannot rely on the provinces to spend the money transferred to them where they ought to and in the service of the needs of the communities. It would be naive to suggest otherwise for daycare. Continuing along in the post-secondary sector, this, of course, adds to the shortage of the staff and the shortage of education. Students that don't have an option to continue in French after a secondary school nearby within about an 80-kilometer radius, according to studies, are deserting French language schools from grade 7, and this phenomenon is speeding up to recent in secondary school to the benefit of the majority. The late Commissioner of Ontario from back in 2016 in minority areas such as Southern Ontario, nearly 2/3 of the students in minority schools will have left the Francophone system and moved to the English system before they get their secondary diploma. Why this exodus? These students and their parents want to make sure that they have a strong enough level of English to be able to continue college studies or university in that language. To say it in clearer terms, the absence of post-secondary French language options are emptying our secondary schools, a phenomenon that is more alarming because we know that it's for teenagers and young adults that they crystallize their identity. In other words, we're losing those young people to the English schools even when the work of construction of the identity that started in early childhood is beginning to bear fruit. I've already recently talked about challenges of post-secondary French language minority institutions in the field of research, so I won't go into depth on that topic, but if you have any questions, please feel free. In conclusion, unless we complete the continuum in education, there will be no rescue of the Francophone community. I hope concrete steps will be taken and that I've been able to clarify the scale of the work to be done, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you, Ms. Chouinard. You couldn't be clearer. So we will start our first round of questions, 6 minutes each. So with the Conservatives, Mr. Généreux, over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us. It's very interesting what you have said. I'd like to ask both of you this question. I think Canada is in a paradoxical situation. The immersion schools are full of people. Parents have to wait for 24 hours. They have to line up to get their kids into immersion. And that was the case where my sister taught. She taught in an immersion school. But in school boards, in the French school boards, there is a lack of funds, a systematic lack of funds. So it's impossible to fill the needs. Ms. Chouinard said so. When we get these kids in kindergarten, one day they might want to teach. Do you see a paradox there? And the other question is about funding. It's not just a question of money, it's also a question of identity. But the fact that the federal government, and we've heard this several times in the past, funds go from the federal government to the provinces through agreements, and accountability isn't done. And so the funds that are sent to the provinces to allow for this continuum of education doesn't happen because the provincial government doesn't allocate these sums for this. Do you believe, Ms. Chouinard, that this is a problem, that these agreements with the provinces, and perhaps you could also mention something about the paradox I mentioned. I'm not sure if I understood your question regarding the paradox between immersion and Francophone schools. If you'd like to ask it again, I will answer it in a better way than I am able to do now. In terms of accountability, well, we know that education is a provincial mandate, but the federal government intervenes. I try to imagine the system, the Francophone education system in a minority situation without the government, federal government. Of course, provinces consider that education is of their jurisdiction, except, and you see it in my document, my 4-page document, is that if we have fundamental values, protection of minorities, if we have Section 23 that provinces signed on to, we must be courageous and defend these. In my presentation, I said that if we didn't ensure the educational system for early childhood, all other efforts won't be, I won't say wasted, but they won't be as efficient as if there is a continuum. Ms. Chouinard?
On vous entend pas. Je vais arrêter l'horloge, là, Bernard.
We can't hear you. We can't hear you. Oh, it's my fault. In the OLEP that we know, there's always 3 pockets of funding for what we call core funding. And that is supposed to be additional funding according to the agreement with the provinces. That's so complementary to what the province provides. And then there's funding for immersion and funding also for minority schools. What we notice is, in fact, is that the funding that is provided from provinces to minorities, in many provinces, the proportion of that funding isn't equal, doesn't even get close to being equal to the proportion of students that are in these schools. So there's a disadvantage, a systematic disadvantage in my province of origin, Labrador Newfoundland. There is, in fact, a court case moving through the courts because because of this issue. Once they get into the provincial system, the rest of the funds is lost and is used as core funding rather than additional funding that the provinces are supposed to provide to the funding that they provide in the provincial funding system. So if the provinces were honest in the way that they use the federal government funding, we might have an issue that isn't as considerable in terms of waiting in terms of families having to wait to get into immersion. In fact, what I was mentioning is that there is an overflow. There's a large demand from Anglophones to put their kids in immersion. That exists. But is there a link that can be established with the fact that the monies that are directed from the federal government to the provinces? Well, we're talking about accountability. We've been told this many times over the years, and Ms. Chouinard just said it. There's money that disappears. Should there be in the agreements an obligation of accountability in terms of how the money is spent? 15 seconds. I think the answer is yes. There's an issue, there's a problem, a difficulty. The provinces don't even have to report their expenses to the school boards, their local school boards, and not even mentioning the federal government. Second round, Liberals, starting with Mr. Iacono. Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for their presence here today. Mr. Bourgeois, a big concern for our committee is often the shortage of labor in education. What does your establishment do in order to remedy this? And do you offer incentives to encourage registration in your programs? I don't have an establishment. I'm a researcher, an autonomous researcher. Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Chouinard. You are a defender, passionate defender of Francophone communities in Francophone minority communities, and you've declared your Francophonie openly. We often ask you your professional opinion about different topics that affect the Francophonie. But today, I would like to tell us your pathway as a mother. You have a daughter, a son. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, a son. And you live in an Anglophone city. Your son is soon of age to go to preschool and daycare. Could you please tell us about your own path when it comes to finding daycare or education for your son? Yes, I'll give you some dates. December 24th, 2021, my partner and myself found out that we were expecting a child. And December 26th, I couldn't have done it sooner. I registered on the waiting list of 2 Francophone daycares in our neighborhood. Our son was born September 2022. I was going back to work on July 1st, 2023. My son got a spot in a Francophone daycare, but it was for July 1st, 2024. So we were on the waiting list of that daycare for a year beyond my maternity leave. During that year, we were part of the 4 children out of 5. I was troubled by this because I thought that I had done everything possible in order to avoid this situation. So I was really desperate. We live in Toronto. I know that you've heard from other witnesses earlier and within your studies that, for instance, in Prince Edward Island, there are 150 children that are waiting a spot in daycare. But in my neighborhood alone, in Toronto, there are 150 kids. So that's not to compete. Just to give you an idea of the large demand. Okay, may I please ask you a question while you describe your journey? Is it an issue of spots? Is it this problem of getting a spot for your child? Does that exist? Has that been in existence for 2 or 3 years or more than 10 years? Because you're talking about over 100 children. Is that a problem that has existed for over 10 years and that hasn't been addressed by any government, be it provincial or federal? Could you confirm that for us? Because it's impossible to say that all of a sudden, since 2015, since the Liberals got to power, this problem has increased. In 2015, I was still doing my PhD. I wasn't really quite ready to have children, and I can't. But the problem existed. The problem of getting a spot. I can't tell you how serious the problem was at that time, but I could tell you that this issue did exist at the time, and there's no doubt about that. The fact is that it got worse recently, in part because of the popularity of the daycare services. In the last few months and in the last few years, with the investments that were made and the agreements that were signed between the federal government and the provinces, the cost of daycare is much lower. And so families that considered that one parent should stay at home are now going back to work because economically it's more viable that the second parent also works. Sorry, again. So that was something positive that happened, that was done by our government, but it led to a negative consequence. Yes, because nobody, of course, among the parents are complaining that the daycare costs are higher, but it did increase the demand. So it was difficult to quantify this when it was done. So that we are told by educator that the expectations have increased, greatly increased, and this because the costs have been lowered. So that's a more recent phenomenon. And when we look at what one can do, financially speaking, in terms of daycares, I hear about that from the administration of my son's daycare, is that the spots for the very young children, where you catch them if you wish, those are the spots that are the most difficult to fund because daycares lose money with these spots. Yes? Thank you, Ms. Chouinard. You'll be able to speak more about this later with other questions, but we really went over the 6 minutes. The second Vice President of this committee, Mr. Beaulieu, 6 minutes for you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our guests. We have 2 guests that are researchers. Mr. Bourgeois talked about the efficiency of the linguistic policy of the federal government, how to assess it. But really, when we look at the Official Languages Act, since it exists since 1969, the assimilation rate of francophones has been increasing since 1969 outside of Quebec. In Quebec, there has been some progress with the constitution that was imposed there, but where there is a majority of francophones, that is Quebec, and they are not recognized as a minority. But Quebecers are a minority in Canada; they are not a majority, and the Official Languages Act just serves to reinforce English in Quebec. We thought it might create change with the new act, but it's obvious that there isn't a change. There is nothing done for French in Quebec in the new act. And so the federal government supports subsidies to francophones outside of Quebec for education. We've seen a lot of testimony that there isn't enough funding for schooling. And earlier we were told that there isn't a public Francophone Public College in British Columbia, no university. So in the end, the federal linguistic policy, isn't it to simply assimilate Francophones, slowly assimilate them outside of Quebec when there is an opportunity to do so? In fact, we weaken French and we strengthen English. I'd like to have your point of view about that.
This has been an argument of a number of Quebecers since the investigation on bilingualism in the 1960s, and especially afterwards, when biculturalism was abandoned and it was more a culture of bilingualism and multiculturalism policy. As to whether the federal government intends to assimilate bit by bit the minority, I've never read, as a researcher, I've never read anything that confirms that the federal government aimed to do that. That's your opinion. I'll leave it at that. Fine. It's a question. We saw that before, and then after there were some criticisms about that. So, Ms. Chouinard. Yes, hello, Mr. Beaulieu. Listen, today's study focuses on the education continuum. I think it's important to keep in mind that according to Section 93 of the 1867 Constitution Act, education is under provincial jurisdiction, and in the field of education, it's a Gordian knot. We've talked about post-secondary, and we'll still talk about it today. The federal government invests. Is it too little? One can certainly discuss that. Personally, I would like to see more, but the heart of the matter is to ensure that when those funds are on the provincial budgets, that they be spent where they're supposed to be spent. And that can be done by language clauses that ought to be imposed on the provinces, particularly to ensure that the funding is invested where it's necessary for the community so that it fulfills the needs. Briefly, the only province where I think that the funding is for the community, the English language minority community from the federal vision, which is certainly a numerical minority, but that is part of the Canadian majority. The only province where they provide funding that I would say is even superior to the proportion of Anglophones, whether it's in preschool, primary, or post-secondary, it is in Quebec. And in that province, the federal government only intervenes to strengthen English. So if the power of Quebec is weakened, if the federal government interferes more in Quebec, then we may think that it's going to be even more harmful to the future of French in Quebec. So isn't it appropriate to the new official, the new Official Languages Act, Mr. Beaulieu, for the first time in history explicitly sets out that the minority language in Canada is the French language. So the federal government, I believe, has given itself a clear instrument here to make sure that this imbalance can be reversed. Now, it's time to implement that lovely act brought in last year. If we look at the plan of action, 2023 through 28, nothing changes. All the funding is for English. So in the act, it says one thing and the contrary. So it admits that Francophones, including in Quebec, form part of a minority, but they continue to talk about the Anglophones in Quebec as a minority. So since we see that this ambiguity appears to be served to continue along the same system as before. 15 seconds, Ms. Chouinard. Well, listen, I think that there's a disagreement on the vision of things, Mr. Beaulieu here. Thank you. Well, I hope it'll change. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Ms. Dance.
I'm new to the committee here, and I'm just trying to understand things. So as researchers, I'm hoping you can maybe share some information with me so that I have a better understanding of what we're looking at here. So the government, so what I can see is that the provinces and territories must provide a per diem for each student. Is that correct? Is that what we're talking about? Is that the federal government provides the provinces with money based on their amount of students? Students just in general.
It varies from province to province. I did a research for the Fédération Nationale des Conseils Scolaires Francophones 2014. Some provinces have a lot of money per student, some have much less. It depends on actually the trend is that the more students they are, New Brunswick, Ontario, for instance, the less money per student.
And is that division when did you compare like Anglophone students to Francophone students? Like when it gets to the provincial level and they start dividing it up, is it being dispersed evenly?
Not evenly. What I did was study the PLOE, OLEP funding, right? So it's for immersion and second language and French first language.
Right.
In every province and territory, if I remember correctly, the funding for French language as a minority language was superior per student, per total, than the amounts for second language French immersion.
Right. But none of that was compared against the English student, like just Anglophone students, like just like the English-speaking classrooms?
No.
Okay.
All I did was compare the PLOE funding, OLEP funding.
Okay. I'm just trying to understand how this is, because both of you have mentioned about how the provincial government isn't spending correctly, and there's a discrepancy. I'm just trying to compare both sides to figure out how we can increase that or make sure that it's on par. Do either of you or both of you have any recommendations on how we can hold the provinces more accountable for those types of things?
Yeah, well, what I suggest is an integrated tripartite plan where everybody knows what everybody is supposed to be doing. Everybody accounts for their spending and their investments. That's probably the best one. I'll give you an anecdote on Prince Edward Island. The school board had to make a request for under the FOIP, Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy legislation, to get access to what how the province was spending its OLEP funding, and the province refused. So even because the pretext was, well, we're negotiating with the federal government, so negotiations between federal and provincial governments preclude the divulgence of information. So I think the best solution, personally, is to have a plan where everybody signs on board and everybody shares the information. We know where we're heading. You do this, I do that, minority school boards do this, and everybody rows in the same direction.
Oh, okay. No, I like that. And so I'll pose the same questions to the other witness. Sorry, I'm drawing up. Madame Chouinard, sorry.
It's okay. So first of all, welcome to the committee.
Thank you.
It's nice to see a new face. So I largely agree with my colleague here. Whether a tripartite agreement or, as some other community members would call, a linguistic clause, where ideally, I think a representative of the provincial community would be a signatory to ensure not only transparency in where the funding goes, but also that where the funding is allocated is on par and represents the priorities and the needs of the community. And nobody else in each province is better placed to tell the province and the federal government where those priorities should be. And as it stands right now with these bilateral agreements in education between the federal and the provinces are free to make up their own priorities, essentially, as to where that funding is allocated. And oftentimes when it is revealed where that funding goes, because it's not always the case, as Danielle just said, we realize that the funding went in places that are absolutely useless for the purpose of the vitality of communities.
If I may,
yeah.
I'll add an example, an anecdote. On Prince Edward Island, the OLEP is served by the province to fund 13.75 teachers. That's supposed to be a primary provincial responsibility. They shouldn't be using OLEP funding to fund the salaries of 13.75 teachers, but they do. The French language school board has asked the province, you can't do that. Canadian Heritage is fully aware of it, does nothing to correct that.
Huh.
Unless in some provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, someone in the community decides to take PCH to court, which is what's happening right now.
So the funding in the PLOE, OLEP, I think in English, is deemed to be supplementary funding to what the province should be putting forward. But right now, that is not how that funding is used in a large amount of times.
And I'll just make this really quick. Did any of you do any research on the staffing shortages? Okay, I just wanted to prepare for the next round. So thank you very much.
Merci, Madame Dance. Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Dance. Thank you. Ms. Gladu, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. And welcome to our witnesses. I'm going to start with Ms. Chouinard. You described the situation now with a great deal of difficulty. What actions must the government take, and what are the priorities? It's a broad question. The first thing, under the new Official Languages Act, French language lens ought to be applied to the new legislation, for example. One of the recent examples that I think is quite obtuse, something that should have been done in the field, and we had to fight for it, is precisely in the Early Childhood Act for the spending, where we had to turn to the Senate because it was not possible in the House to add an amendment that would protect explicitly directed minority language funding. The Official Languages Act ought to work horizontally to solve issues like that, so that issues such as this can be thought of in the legislative drafting process rather than while debating a bill. That would already be a good step forward. The other issue is that when there are signatures, here we're talking about the field of education, and so we're always going to have to deal with the provinces and territories to ensure transparency and accountability through linguistic clauses to make sure that the funding sent from the federal government to the provinces is spent according to what is supposed to be spent on, and that it's possible to demonstrate that and prove it. Thank you.
The charter. So it's a bit vague in the charter. It doesn't really say how many students of a Francophone or minority language you would have to have before you have to fund a school for them. And it doesn't seem to cover post-secondary or the early childhood education. So if changes were to be made, what would you like to see changed there?
I think the overall problem in the entire system, education-wise, is that the province do not respect the obligations. We sometimes usually refer to the executive powers or the exclusive powers of the minority language school boards, and we haven't even gone there yet. It's not even complete. But the biggest problem is that provinces have obligations, according to MAE and other jurisprudence, and they're not doing their job either. So nobody has thus far sued the provinces or forced the provinces to the table and say, listen, you have obligations to promote the official language minority education system, regardless of the OLEP. They have that responsibility. Now, if the federal government wants to help them do that, that's fine. If not, they still have that obligation. So that's probably one of the. So the second part of your question, I'm trying to remember.
Alors, vous avez étudié.
So you studied school management law, so it would be interesting to tie it in with Section 23. The right to manage schools and the current modes of federal funding. It would also be interesting to ask them directly to comment on the provisions of a decision in the current agreement protocol, memorandum of agreement. I think that the OLEP should be completely separated from the funding which would be paid directly from the federal government to the school boards for the cultural and community mandate. So the schools, the school boards are responsible, but the cultural and community mandate could be taken out of the OLEP agreement, which would be completely separate and would bypass the provinces and territories that are recalcitrant.
ask either of you if you have other recommendations that you would like the federal government to take action on. You can send those to the clerk of the committee, and it will be incorporated in our final report. But thank you so much for your testimony today. It's much appreciated.
Merci, Mme Gladue. Monsieur Marc Serré, allez-y pour 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Un gros merci aux deux rechercheurs ici aujourd'hui pour votre témoignage.
Thank you very much to our two researchers for their testimony in terms of the content of education, early childhood, primary, secondary, post-secondary. It's clear that we have gaps, important gaps. We've heard it in fact, throughout our study, and it's the case in Ontario. We know that there are huge challenges. The frustration that we have. You did research in terms of the Constitution and in terms of the responsibilities for provinces. I would like to start with Ms. Chouinard. When we talk about certain elements, the federal government has probably set more conditions with regards to certain agreements than before, but it's not enough. You know that we have the Court Challenges program. You know that Quebec was against it. It went to the Canadian Heritage, but we did anchor this in official languages. Do the community groups, the Francophone community groups, should they use this program to go against provinces in order to ensure that the funding is applied for early childhood, secondary, and post-secondary? Thank you, Mr. Serré. I don't know if you know, but you'll know now. I'm one of the experts that sits on the official languages, Court Challenges program. So I have a good idea of all the applications and what is funded also. And yes, this appears in all the files that are tabled for the Court Challenges program. But in order to be funded, one of the criteria is that it must raise an issue of law that is new since 1982. We know that there's a plethora of cases that went all the way to Supreme Court in terms of Section 23. So there are some issues that are considered to be already solved, whether it be done, whether it be solved in the ways that communities wish it to be solved or not. So it's within that context that choices are made. So funding for early childhood and post-secondary, there are certain elements that still need to be established, but there is already some case law in certain files. For instance, the obligation of a province to have to add to a new building, to have to add daycare spaces. And in this case, the Supreme Court wasn't willing to go that far. So we have to see what needs to be done and whether the cases raise new issues of law. Is that the only way we'll get sanctions in terms of funding for minority communities? Because it seems there's no political will with provinces. Are you able to look at, to advocate in order to have more done with? I'm not sure if I understood your question. Right now, the parameters of the program, do they need to be broadened so that other organizations can take the provinces to court to meet the obligations that under the Constitution? Because education is the jurisdiction of provinces. As a member of the committee, I'm stepping on eggshells here, but there is one limit, that one obstacle that organizations are faced with, that is the ceilings that are imposed on the funding. With the funding that we have now, we often can't meet the demand for a whole court case. And we've heard the British Columbia School Board mention it. They talked about the fact that we have to draw funding from the operating budget, so funding that should fund the schools, in order to fund court cases against the province. And that really means that we're faced with very serious issues, because the quality of education can't be the same. If the school boards are stuck in front of the courts, they have to fund these court proceedings from the schools. Thank you. We've gone over time a little bit. Mr. Beaulieu, 2.5 minutes. Yes, wait, very quickly. We've seen all the testimonies presented here. It's confirmed there are several Anglophone provinces that refuse to fund a minimal educational continuum for Francophone and Acadian minority communities. Even the federal government seems to sometimes go around the issue and doesn't have the will to really require accountability. So the assimilation continues, and at some point, it's there's no going back in terms of the prejudice suffered by minority Francophone and Acadian communities. So what is the future? If there isn't a major change, and this has to happen quickly, we're heading towards more and more assimilation. So what are the future perspectives with regards to this? At the Prince Edward Island, where I worked the most, there has been a change. About 10 or 15 years ago, there were 850 students. Now there's about 13 and a bit, and it will be 1,500 soon. I'm wondering if in 15, 20 years, if all these students will be proud, if they have built their identity on the Francophone identity, will this improve things? Of course, we have to ask also what about the identity? Is it solid enough? And there's also the fact that the funds through the PLOE, through the OLEP, will help. Yes, but when you look at the numbers objectively, this doesn't seem to be the case. There are schools where a good proportion of students don't speak French. We talked about it earlier, so we'll see. Ms. Chouinard, I don't know if you would like to comment on this. I think I'll say the future is for those who are prepared to fight for it. Yes, well, I think we'll continue fighting for it. We don't have a choice. You always have to get up earlier and get to go to bed later than others if you want to be successful. We're going to the NDP now. Mr. Dents, your turn, 2.5 minutes.
You spoke about how currently the government has a 5-year plan, and you don't like that. It didn't seem like you liked that number. If you could tell us what you think the ideal number would be.
It's in my 4-page document, 2067, Canada's bicentennial. We should have, if Finland can have an education plan for 22, 23 years, not sure why we shouldn't. We have an official language plan for 5 years. We have education plans for 5 years. We have OLEP funding for 5 years. There is no education system in the world that functions 5 years at a time.
5 years at a time. So can you tell me, in your opinion, if what happens to the French minority communities when a French school or daycare closes, and overall what's going to happen to the Canada's official language if the communities don't have access to French languages and education supports?
We have anecdotal evidence about schools being closed, which was the 1960s centralization, elimination of small schools into consolidated schools throughout the country. I'll give you an anecdote. My wife is from Tignish, PI, and she did her first year of schooling, grade 1, in a French language school. Then the province came in and consolidated the 6 French language schools in the Tignish area into none. they had to go to English language schools. She became assimilated. Her sisters became assimilated. The entire village called Tignish Shore became assimilated 20 years later. We have other examples of that throughout the country. We also have examples of schools being built, like in Chiswick in Nova Scotia, where the community revitalized itself. There's probably going to be hits and misses, but without a school, and secondarily, without early childhood development, it's doomed to failure.
Okay. Thank you so much. I just want to thank both of you for sharing all of your research and information with our committee today. Thank you.
Merci. Écoutez, on a frappé le nerf de la guerre aujourd'hui.
Thank you. We really hit the important issues with the quality of your comments. If you think that there might be additional information that you would like to share with us, Ms. Chouinard, Mr. Bourgeois, the committee can only put in its report what the witnesses say. So if there are any other opinions or comments that you would like to see included, Mr. Bourgeois, Madame Chouinard, I would like to use my privilege to ask a question. Is there a legal argument to make in terms of the management of schools and the fact that we keep our school boards away from negotiations with regards to the federal provincial agreements? Could we do something differently in the future? It takes a tripartite plan. That's what I was saying. Who is going to represent the minority? It's those who are elected universally, who are on the school boards. You have elected representatives here. Federally, there are provincial representatives that represent the minorities, but they're not at the table. They're not even consulted efficiently. Some provinces require consultations, others don't. But it is not efficient consultation. So who represents the minorities? But in fact, they have exclusive powers. But these powers aren't even exclusive, in fact. We've had Section 23 for 40 years. Since 1990, this covers the management of schools, but it's not the case. We're just treading water here. There is no school board anywhere in the country that exercises these exclusive powers. What does that mean, exclusive, if it's shared with the government? I think at some point you have to stop and say, well, either the power is exclusive or it isn't. And if they are exclusive, then let's give them to the minorities, to the school boards that represent the minorities. It's as if we said, well, if the province doesn't want to decentralize its powers to the school boards, then the school boards should get powers and have court cases against them. But the funding doesn't follow suit. The school board says, okay, we're going to do what we can, but the developing programs, cultural programs, identity programs, if the means aren't attributed as needed, then it's very difficult to exercise these powers. You can't get the money from the church, for instance, for funding drives at the church, so that they should be at the table. And just a little note, in New Brunswick, I've been working for 2 years with the Acadian community. I don't want to do any province bashing, but the New Brunswick government is very favorable. They're doing a co-construction of a Francophone education. There's an Anglophone deputy minister and a Francophone deputy minister. The Francophone deputy minister is totally game in order to make sure that they have full school management, and that's going to happen within a year or two. So that is something positive. We're looking at the future. It's New Brunswick, so it might be different. But since Nova Scotia showed the example with program development, it's the only jurisdiction, the only school board that develops the program, and that's really the issue at the heart of this, how to teach children. The New Brunswick, so they're leaders on that file, but New Brunswick might be a leader in this other with regards to this other issue, and we hope that it will snowball. Thank you. Ms. Chouinard, do you have anything to add? Well, I'd like to reinforce what Danielle just said by reminding you that at the turn of the century, there was the Supreme Court decision that established explicitly that school boards and Francophone parents in minority communities should be recognized as representatives. So there is case law and jurisprudence to support my colleagues' comments. Thank you so much to your advice, to your answer. It was very informative. We're going to end on this. Thank you so much, dear witnesses, and have a great day.